Hey guys, Matthew Weiss here, doing another little mix analysis. This one is recommended from Jalal Fakhri. Sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, probably embarrassing myself, but hey, never stopped me before. Anyway, Jalal says that it would be cool if you did an analysis of another Manny mix, Attention by Charlie Puth, which is a great record, and I asked if there was any particular aspects he'd like me to focus on. He said the relationship between the kick drum and the bass guitar throughout, and how the interrelation comes together in a way that sounds really aggressive but not overwhelming. In addition, the vocals during the chorus section have a particularly airy quality while maintaining some body and not sounding overly thin, all while remaining out of the way of the rest of the instrumentation. How is this most likely achieved? I love these questions. I love when they're very specific and we can talk about very qualitative aspects of a production. This one is going to focus more on arrangement and technique than mix, because I believe that that's where most of these things are coming from, and a lot of times that is going to be the answer to these questions. But let's get into it and let's see what we can learn from it.
Expect, but you're not coming home with me tonight. You just want attention. You don't want my heart. Maybe you just hate the thought of me with someone new. Yeah, you just want attention. I knew from the start. You're just making sure I'm never getting over you. Oh. You've been running around, throwing that dirt all on my name.
Okay, we got a lot of really interesting things to talk about. Let's do the vocal one first, because I feel like that's going to be pretty easy to explain. The reason why his voice is able to sound so airy but not lose any body is because of his singing technique. So the first thing is that he's got a very robust falsetto. There are certain singers who have very strong falsettos. The Weeknd comes to mind really quickly, Labyrinth comes to mind really quickly, and Charlie Puth. He has a very good falsetto. On top of that, he is doing a technique called overbreathing, which sort of it pushes more air over the vocal cords than what the vocal cords can actually deal with. And so they've constricted to make their note, but more air is coming. So rather than saying, I just want to love you, or whatever it is, it's, I just want to love you, with that extra in the voice. Because that's already there, it allows for him to create his own sense of airiness without needing to EQ out any body of the voice or overly stretch the top end with an EQ. So the airiness is there. Because of that, Manny is able to really just focus on the body and the main vocal and make sure that it's nice and well represented. And because there's not a lot of other competing instrumentation, especially in the first chorus, that's not too hard to get away with. Let me jump over to the second chorus and see what that sounds like.
Just want attention. You don't want my heart. Maybe you just hate the thought of me with someone new.
So it's kind of the same thing. There's really not a whole lot of instrumentation, even in the second chorus where there's a little bit more going on, and some of those higher percussion elements do mask a little bit of that airiness, and so the vocal actually does sound slightly thinner and smaller in the second chorus, but by that time we've already had the vocal well established, so we've heard it as being full and robust. In our minds, it hasn't changed. If we were to listen to it out of order, we might think of it a little bit differently, which is sort of an interesting psychological effect of records. So similarly, we've got something going on with the kick drum and the bass.
Just want attention. I knew from the start.
The reason why it's so easy to get such a big kick and bass sound without making it feel overwhelming or overly aggressive is because there's nothing else there in the record. If we had all sorts of bells and whistles, then it would be a whole nother story, but it's literally the only other instrumentation besides a very, very small clap sound in the vocal. And so because of this, we're able to get this enormous kick and this enormous bass because there's nothing else taking up the space or masking it. Now, once everything else kicks in, that's a little different.
'Cause you knew that I'd call you up. Baby, now that we're right here standing face to face.
So with that, there's a couple of things that changed. One is that there is a percussion element that's layered on top of the kick. It's subtle, it's there, it's just drawing attention to the attack, which allows us to hear the kick. The other thing is that the kick drum is the loudest element in the mix at this point. It is taking up most of the space, and so everything else is kind of working around the kick. And that also plays a big part. The order in which we mix things and the decision to make the kick the focus is what's allowing it to be so big. And it's important because that, along with the bass, is what's driving the record. If those are not big, we are always going to be losing, even when there are other elements in there. So, that it's more of a question of what we're focusing on, less of a question of technique. Now, are there some techniques involved? Yes, there's probably a lot of EQing that's getting any kind of excess low end out of the vocals or the guitars or some of the various percussion elements, but most of those are living well above the bass range anyway, so there probably doesn't need to be too much attenuation unless there was just like bad pickups or something like that. Now, in terms of the shaping of the kick, I find that to be pretty interesting because you can actually hear that the transient is kind of squared off a little bit. It has this kind of like, it's hard to describe. It's not like a spiky transient or a rounded transient. It's like almost like a flat squared out transient. And it's got a very distinct sound if you're used to hearing it. To me, it sounds like there's some kind of soft clipping going on. This could be from pushing a console. I know that Manny sometimes stems out to his console, so if he's pushing into the red, then on drums it's going to create that effect. Another couple of ways of doing it, the way that I do it is I use either Soundtoys Decapitator on the A setting, and I give it just a little bit of drive on a kick drum, so like 2 or 3. It's a pretty mild setting, but it's enough just to kind of square out the transient a little bit, which makes me able to raise the overall level of the kick, makes it bigger, but it also kind of makes it boofy. Another way of soft clipping it, let's see, there's the Joey Sturgis Tones clip is a good way. Just a little dab will do you on that one. And the Air Lo-Fi plugin has a clip control as well that sounds really good, and that can be used to just ever so slightly clip a kick so that it kind of, it's almost like putting a limiter on it actually, but slightly more aggressive. And if you find that sweet spot, you can do it without getting too many like grungy harmonics, so it still sounds pretty round, but it makes it boofier because all of that sustain is being pushed up right into the front of the kick. Well, that's to me what sounds like is happening here on the kick specifically. The bass, probably a subtle amount of distortion and some roll-off. It's a pretty dark bass overall, but it definitely has like very distinct, rich midtones.
You've been running around, throwing that dirt all on my name. 'Cause you knew that I'd call you up.
The other thing to note is that it's a bass guitar, and bass guitars don't really carry as much sub as like sub synths, so those will get along with kick drums, especially these lower octave kick drums like the one in this record, a lot more easily than say something like a Moog bass, where you're going to have a lot of sub content very frequently and you're going to have to work around it. So another thing that's working is just the instrumentation. Anyway, so there's some cool stuff happening in this mix for sure. I love what Manny does with the stereo field. I really like the choice to go from this very, very spacey kind of reverbed out pre-chorus into this very tight, almost anti-chorus chorus.
Love me with someone new tonight. Ooh, and now I'm all up on you. What you expect? But you're not coming home with me tonight. You just want attention. You don't want my heart.
Right, spatially speaking, the pre-chorus actually has a lot more size to it. We've got the 2 double vocals, the unisons pan left and right, and then we've got this kind of long plate reverb that's going on and being automated right at the transition point. Everything is like very spread out in stereo, and then when it kicks into the chorus, everything becomes very mono and very dry, and it just becomes this very this tight driving sound, and it almost becomes an anti-chorus, but because of that it creates this really great contrast, and it's very exciting to listen to. So I think that that's one of the most interesting things happening mix-wise, and I think that it was a great decision. Anyway, the big takeaway from this is that a lot of the times when we are aspiring mixers, we think that there's some kind of like magic thing that's happening. And sometimes there is a little bit of that, but a lot of it is really just good decision making. And that good decision making generally revolves around respecting what the producer already put in there and kind of getting out of the way a little bit. Just making sure that whatever is there is shining in the right light. And that usually doesn't involve any kind of like special modulated reverb, reverse echo delay flanger things. Like it really is usually just like maybe some tightening of EQ, but mostly just, setting the levels right and making sure that it's all translating the way that it was intended. And I would say if you can do that, then 90% of the mix is usually going to be there if the production's good. Anyway, guys, if you dig what I'm doing, don't forget to subscribe to my channel here. And if you want to get into more in-depth stuff, hop on over to the Pro Audio Files YouTube channel. I've got very detailed explanations of certain things where I do demonstrations of mixes I've worked on, things like that. And yeah, if you want me to do an analysis of something in particular, something that strikes your interest, drop a comment in the comment section. I'm usually pretty good about answering those. All right, guys, until next time.